Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I have someone very special with me. Her name is Natasha Coulter, and she is an occupational therapist. She has been in the field for almost a decade and serving Vancouver community, and she graduated her program from Kingston, Ontario. But I'll let Natasha introduce herself. We've had conversations outside this session, and I thought what she does is so incredible that it's really helpful for the community to know what she does and how she can support folks who struggle with PTSD or anxiety or agoraphobia. And she does a very specialized technique of therapy called ERP and much more. So I'll let Natasha jump in. Welcome, Natasha. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm on land acknowledgement on Kwantlen territories as a settler, and I'm honored to be in this conversation with you. So welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. So tell us, Natasha, what you do. I know being in the profession of the work we do, we know what OTs are, but for folks who don't know what's an OT, like tell them what is an OT.
Awesome. Yeah. So like you said, I've been an OT for 10 years working in mental health. And yeah, I know a lot of people don't know what an occupational therapist is. When I first tell people what I do, the most common responses, of course, is, oh, so you help people find jobs.
Yes.
Right. And you know what? Yeah, that absolutely can be a part of the OT profession, but we do so much more. In general, OTs, like we work in such a broad spectrum of areas of practice. We work with people of all ages with any sort of like physical, emotional, or mental health issue, any kind of disease process. And the overarching thing that we do as an OT is get people back to what's meaningful for them in their lives. Traditionally, the word occupation basically meant anything you do to occupy your time, which is how the occupational therapist title came to be. So yeah, if you think of anything that you do to occupy your time doing a typical day, and then if you think of that day, what would that day look like if you had a physical injury, if you had a mental illness? So we help you kind of bridge the gap between where you're at that moment with any of that illness or disease process and where you actually want to be and what's meaningful for you. So yeah, it's meaningful occupation is kind of the core of the OT profession.
Absolutely. And I know you specialize in PTSD and anxiety, and you like using ERP in your work. So tell me, like, what's the difference, in your opinion, between agoraphobia, PTSD for someone who doesn't know, who's stuck at home, feels they need to be out and about and is not able to perform? Like, what do you think is going on for them?
So, PTSD, many people are familiar with it, post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD comes from experiencing a traumatic event. So I'm not a psychologist, but if you look at the DSM-5, it has a very specific definition of what a traumatic event is and what the criteria needs to be met in order to have that diagnosis of PTSD. But basically, it's a traumatic event, and then it results in the diagnosis of PTSD. Agoraphobia is an anxiety-related disorder, so it's on a different spectrum. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a specific trauma. So it's anxiety-related, where people have a fear of leaving the house for a fear of having a panic attack or an anxiety attack, or not being able to escape what they perceive as an unsafe situation to go back to their home, which is generally where they perceive their safe situation to be. And having something really embarrassing happen out there, like they perceive that anxiety attack or a panic attack as something very embarrassing. So they avoid any kind of situations that potentially would put them in that situation of having that panic attack. So they often just simply hardly ever leave their house.
Right. Yes. And then they feel stuck at home. And so do you think PTSD, someone who has been through traumatic experience, can that cause agoraphobia?
So the research shows that some people, yes, that have a traumatic event that develop PTSD can go on to develop agoraphobia, but it's not necessarily the case in everything. And right. Same with, even if people experience a traumatic event, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to develop PTSD. Right. But the core sort of combination, but the thing that's the same between both PTSD and agoraphobia is the base of anxiety. So both of people have anxiety, even though PTSD is a trauma-related disorder and agoraphobia is an anxiety-related disorder. They both have that anxiety component in common.
Right. And how do you like support these folks?
So I use something called prolonged exposure therapy. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the symptoms of each, and then you can kind of see how they kind of come together and why I use this specific therapy for both things. Because yeah, even though there are different disorders, they kind of have some commonalities that benefit from the prolonged exposure, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. So PTSD, I think many people might be familiar with some of the symptoms about like the intrusive nightmares, the flashbacks, the memories, that kind of thing. I think we see that maybe in the movies and stuff. So that's a very common symptom of PTSD. Emotional dysregulation is a big one. So I often see people who are very tearful, very tearful. That's a very new symptom for them. They might not be used to experiencing that. Lots of irritability, lots of anger, very, very common symptom there. So very new things for people. Negative thoughts, we hear a lot about that in the counseling world, about negative thoughts about oneself or just about the world in general. So people with PTSD often experience that as something quite new, that they don't necessarily have that before. And all of a sudden they've got these negative perceptions of everything that's going on around them. It can be quite distressing. Being detached from other people and social isolation. People with PTSD withdraw quite significantly, quite quickly. You can imagine when you're emotionally dysregulated and really tearful and irritable and angry, you don't really want to be around other people a lot.
And which is like one feeds the other. You're not around people, and then you are isolated and you're afraid, you're trying to protect yourself, but to heal, like you want to live your life, you want to be out and about. Yeah.
Exactly. And then when you're out and about and, the world is busy, it's chaotic, it can be crazy. So these, people with PTSD, another symptom is that hypervigilance. So they're constantly scanning their environment for threats or perceived threats. And a lot of that startle response if they have loud noises or sirens. So again, it's that circle of that withdraw from life activity because, well, I don't want to be out and about if I'm scared and constantly looking in my environment for a threat. So I might as well just stay home. So it's pretty scary, the symptoms that come on. And so it just sort of feeds into that fear and avoidance. And then the world becomes smaller and smaller and people just don't leave their house.
Yeah. Yeah. And that becomes agoraphobia in some ways eventually.
So that's kind of the similarity with your agoraphobia. So people, they're not leaving their house, not because of the PTSD, but, agoraphobia, there's a few different reasons why it develops. It's not as clear as the PTSD. So it could have something to do with a traumatic incident, but maybe not a trauma that meets the DSM diagnosis and criteria of a trauma, but a perceived trauma for the individual, which is just as significant and as important. Absolutely, right? But that leads to the anxiety and the fear and the avoidance. And then, the people just aren't leaving their house. So, I think there's a perception that often agoraphobia is like that fear of open spaces.
Right.
But right. Yeah. And I'm not really sure where that came from, but that can be one component of it. Absolutely. But it's so much more than that. So it's often the opposite. It's the fear of the enclosed spaces. So imagine yourself in a busy grocery store, like in a busy theater, or just any building that, you might be around a lot of people that you don't know where the exits are. And all of a sudden that fear of, how am I going to get out of here? That fear of, what if I have a panic attack and there's no one here to help me, or have a panic attack and all these people see me having it. So that's what feeds into that fear and avoidance pattern for the agoraphobia. So it's like, well, if all these things might happen if I leave the house and do that, well, I'm just not going to do it.
Right.
It's just too scary. So it feeds over to, these closed in spaces, but oh my goodness, transportation. What if I'm on a SkyTrain, or what if I'm on a bus? What if I'm on an airplane? Oh, can't do that. Oh, what if I go to the bank and I'm standing in line and there's all these people there and can't do that. Driving and I'm stuck in traffic. And what if I can't get off my exit? No, can't do that. So all of a sudden, kind of similar to the PTSD, but for different reasons, your world is very, very small.
Right. And what happens when our world becomes small is we feel lonely, isolated, we are limiting ourselves, we are not reaching our full potential, and then we develop more psychosomatic symptoms and not seeing anyone.
And then, further to that, then our friends and family don't necessarily understand what's going on. It's like, well, you used to be like this and now you're like this. And well, I don't get it. You kind of seem fine. It's that invisible disability. I look at you and, well, yeah, just get out. Just go do it. Like, just go.
I hate
That's
that. Just do it. If it was so easy, like we wouldn't exist.
exactly. Then it just sounds so easy from the outside looking in, but for people from that inside looking out that have this complicated constellation of symptoms that are so hard to understand themselves and articulate to others to understand, people just cut off other ties, like their social ties, even more.
Right. Yeah.
It's really sad. It's tough. Yeah.
So how does the prolonged exposure therapy then come into action, come into play, and support these folks?
Yeah. So I use the prolonged exposure therapy for both the PTSD and agoraphobia because what it does, it's kind of it's a type of cognitive behavior therapy. So it looks at the behavior, the thoughts, and the emotions that we're all looking at, but it does it in a very, very structured way. So it's designed to kind of confront an individual's like memories of the traumatic incident, kind of for PTSD, look at the feelings behind everything that's happening about those fear and avoidance of leaving the house, and then connecting with the emotions about why everything is happening. Mm-hmm. So it sounds very complicated, but it's done in a very structured way. And when you intentionally face those fears and thoughts and emotions and behaviors and do it repeatedly, it kind of takes down the hold that all of those things have over you and opens up the world again.
Right.
So what we do is we create a fear hierarchy or a fear ladder about, let's just take a task of, perhaps going to the grocery store. So what has to happen between an individual being at their home and getting to the grocery store? So we literally break down every single step that a person has to take to get from A to B, for example. And then we rate, while we're still in the safety of the home, how that would feel. Would it be on a scale of 1 to 10, like a 1 or a 2 or 3, 4, all the way up to, just going to the grocery store might be a 10. And then we tackle those tasks that are broken down step by step.
Yes.
One by one. Over and over again, we repeat them until the anxiety for each step comes down.
Right. Until the desensitization happens and they feel able to do it.
They feel able to do it. So that's the one component of prolonged exposure therapy. So that's the in vivo component where we're actually doing like real life tasks out and about in the community. So that's primarily what I do as the OT. And then the other component of prolonged exposure therapy is the imaginal exposure. So often that's done. I work in conjunction with a lot of counselors or psychologists that might be doing that component. I can do it as well, but many people that come to work with me already have a counselor in place. So they're doing that piece. So that's where they're recounting the traumatic memory. You're closing your eyes, you're visualizing it, you're connecting with it emotionally, you're telling your story. Again, it's that emotional processing repeated over and over again until that emotional trigger reduces. Again, that desensitization, that habituation piece. So people can restructure these memories, thoughts, and feelings into something that's more manageable and something that just makes more sense.
Right. So in your experience, Natasha, what do you see like folks typically need how long in order for them to move forward in their life?
So, like many therapies, the more consistent repeated work you do, the more quickly you're going to move forward. The protocol generally says between 8 and 15 sessions. So 12 sessions on average, once a week, I would work with an individual. Most sessions tend to be around 60 to 90 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then, there's homework assignments in between. So, individuals can do that imaginal exposure piece independently as well. And then there's some expectation that we can set up to do the in vivo prolonged exposure as well. Mm-hmm. So the exposures can be done. The protocol says it doesn't have to be done with a healthcare professional. Once we've set up the program, Individuals can do it on their own. They can do it with like a friend or a family member, anybody sort of that they trust to support through the process. So people see results quite quickly if you're doing the work. Absolutely. And it works. It works.
I like what you said, that consistency and, you know, that expectation that you'll be doing the exercises or the homework that has been assigned.
Yeah.
And having, you know, a supportive other, like whether it's a family member or you as a professional, I think can definitely make a difference. So I know in our work, people typically would come to us, but in your field, like you would do community-based work or in-home therapy. Yeah. And what do you feel is the benefit of you visiting them versus they coming to you?
So particularly with the prolonged exposure therapy, doing that in vivo component, like so many of my clients like literally barely leave their house. Mm-hmm. So if I'm not coming to them, like one, they're probably not going to come to me to start with. So they're not going to be getting the therapy that they need.
Right.
Two, if they do come to me, it's probably such a stressor and so anxiety provoking for them to get to me in the first place that by the time they come to me, their tolerance for therapy is already so diminished.
Right.
And, you know, prolonged exposure therapy, it's hard. It's really hard. Mm-hmm. Like you're getting out there, you're confronting your fears, you're staying in your feared situation for an extended period of time. So by me actually going to their home and community, it takes away that one piece that,
of
you know,
stress. Absolutely.
Exactly. So by the time I get to them, they're a little bit better placed to actually participate in therapy, and they're going to get so much more out of it.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other benefits do you see in terms of, I'm thinking that in their space, a little bit more safety perhaps, right? Like,
yeah, you got that comfort and safety piece. And then, you know, I get to see them and be like, okay, so, you know, take me through your home, like walk me through your typical day, show me what it is that you're having difficulty with. You know, people might not want to disclose that over the phone or in an office environment, but, you know, I can see that pile of, you know, undone laundry, or the dishes have got piled up, or I can see the tasks that maybe they're just not quite doing for whatever reason that is. And then I can offer that more personalized treatment plan and be like, oh, you know what? I see that pile of laundry over there. Like, you can tell me about that. Is that like something that you're struggling with, or is that just the norm? Or so we could just really target that treatment plan a little bit more to the activities that are important to them, and be like, you know, if they don't want to do the laundry and it's piled up like that, you know, maybe that's the norm, or maybe we can outsource it, but we can problem solve if that's something that's really bothering them, and focus on the things that are actually important to them.
Absolutely. So have you seen some examples of this working out, some success stories? Like, give us that good feel good thing, right? Like,
good thing. Oh my goodness, where do I start? Yeah.
I'm sure you have lots, but tell us about your, not the favorite clients, but like some success stories where you feel like the work I've done is, you know, worth it, like rewarding, like we become helpers because it feels good, right? In some ways. So
exactly. Yeah. And sure, I've got lots of success stories, but, you know, there's one particular client that comes to mind that, you know, when I first started working with them, they were so compromised. It was actually really hard for me to see. They hadn't left their home further than literally half a block on the sidewalk for months. They required 24/7 care, just for, you know, fears and anxieties around being alone, and, you know, some suicidal ideation as well. So when I started working with them, like literally the goals were just to get out of the house, walk that half a block, you know, get some fresh air, move there through like the neighborhood, whereas they had been participating in other activities within the neighborhood, within like, you know, just running those errands and doing the IADLs, like grocery shopping, just those basics. Mm-hmm. So we moved through the prolonged exposure protocol. We made tasks, we made goals, we broke everything down. We did a bit more intensive therapy, was more like twice a week, because he was so compromised, but also very motivated and really committed to, you know, participating in the protocol and getting better. About 6 months later, I'll have to say this was a little bit longer, because this individual was so compromised to start with. Leaving the house, no problem. Walking tolerance, anywhere they needed to go. Cycling tolerance, wherever they wanted to go pre-injury. driving tolerance, oh my goodness, up to about 30 kilometers, which was significantly different than before, and return to work.
Right. Wow. Yeah, no, that's huge. Not being able to go half a block to increasing it to 30 kilometers is a success.
It's a big success story. So yeah, this one was probably a bit more intensive therapy and a bit more longer than the typical duration that you might see, but it just shows that if you stick with the protocol and do the work and have it consistent, that yeah, going from barely being able to leave the house half a block to actually returning to full-time work and getting this individual's life back is just, it's significant. It's huge. It's huge.
Right. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. So if someone is not motivated, like how can they, like, is there something they can do on their own, or like, would you recommend some strategies, like just not motivated?
Yeah, you know, and not everybody is. Like it's a hard protocol. It's very anxiety provoking. It's really stressful. So, you know, if people maybe aren't quite motivated to participate in the full protocol, and like I said before, with both PTSD and agoraphobia, the commonality is anxiety. So I really encourage people to understand anxiety. Like educate yourself what anxiety is, because a lot of people simply don't know or don't understand. And then really understand what anxiety looks like for you. Like I often hear people be like, well, I went from 0 to 100. I don't know what happened. It's like, well, something's happened in between there. So let's really unpack that and figure that out. So you know what's going on with you and what your symptoms are, whether, yeah, it's your breathing or your heart rate, or you sweating, is it GI distress? So let's zero in on what anxiety looks like and feels like for you. And then let's pick a strategy. Like, let's pick an anxiety management strategy. So I go over the breathing techniques, some of the mindfulness techniques. Let's pick one that resonates with you, and then practice. Do that every single day. I really encourage people to use their anxiety management strategies when they're not anxious. So they can really feel what it feels like to use those strategies, because you know, when you're anxious or close to that panic, you just can't even think to use them.
Yeah.
Like the prefrontal cortex goes offline. You're not thinking straight. Amygdala's firing up. You're scared. You're running. So I'm like, use these strategies when you don't need them. And then when you do need them, they're going to kick in a bit more naturally. Hopefully, you know, making sure that anxiety doesn't hit that panic state.
Right. And what do you think, Natasha, are some of the misconceptions folks might have around, you know, PTSD and agoraphobia and the anxieties, like there's not wide enough, you know, outreach work done or conversation happening on regular basis, right? Like you turn the news on, there's all this, they are trying to makes everything sensational, that where people actually are struggling, that's not being talked about or addressed, or, you know, is addressed in a very specific way, when there is this whole wide, you know, wide spectrum of things going on.
There's so much going on. Yeah. Like I think the first thing with PTSD is, you know, originally I think people thought it was like simply for like military or first responders. And we know that's simply not true. Yeah, that people can develop PTSD as a result of a traumatic event. But like I said, you know, the DSM diagnosis for PTSD, the traumatic event description is very, very specific.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. And then the other thing is that not everybody who experiences a traumatic event develops PTSD.
Right. Yes.
That's the other thing as well. Like, you know, people might have a traumatic event and develop symptoms, you know, because it's an exposure to an abnormal situation. So it's normal to be symptomatic after that. So yeah, like getting in touch with a therapist or something after an incident that's distressing to you is absolutely normal, and that's okay. Get that treatment. It doesn't mean you're going to develop PTSD.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a very important thing for people to realize. Yeah. And then with the agoraphobia, again, it comes back to the open spaces. People think it's such a fear of open spaces, but it's just so much more complex than that. It's a really misunderstood, I think, diagnosis as well. And being that invisible disability, like I have many clients with agoraphobia that function quite well.
Yes.
They know how to hide it.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So you might get an individual who, maybe now is working from home because the pandemic has made that more the norm. So they can function in the work environment because they don't have to leave the house. Maybe they have their groceries delivered,
Yes.
or right. And, in terms of like social interactions, if they get invited out, they might be like, oh, well, I'm busy that night. Or, oh, well, maybe could we just go to the coffee shop down the street? That would work so much better because I have this other thing to do. So they learn how to manage it quite well.
Hide it quite well.
Exactly. You can hide it quite well. So it's it's quite an interesting diagnosis. You do get the extremes where some people absolutely do not function, but you get people that actually function quite well.
Right. Yeah.
But their world is small.
Yeah. Of course. Yes. And I'm sure like you've seen different kind of compulsions in your work. So what are some, you said you work with wide variety of compulsions, and I really like that. Like as I was looking through your website. So what are some of the compulsions or some, strange things which for that individual are not strange? That's their world.
Oh my God, you know what, it's all over the spectrum. Like it's, most of the people, not saying most, like, but lots of people have some like eating disorders, the compulsions of eating some odd things. A lot of it's counting and fear-based. If I don't, count this many times or flip the light switch or go back to the house like X number of times, then there's going to be these catastrophic like events that are going to happen. And they just, to them, it makes sense.
Yes.
To the average other person, like there's no correlation between the two things. It just doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, I see those types of things a lot. So it's really just breaking that association between like, flipping the light switch X number of times and some catastrophic event happening. It's learning to tolerate that distress. If you don't switch that light switch and then you see, well, that catastrophic event didn't occur, and then breaking that cognitive association between the two things.
Yes, I think the work that you do is so incredible. What are some of the resources, Natasha, you would share with folks, or just in general, anyone who's listening to this? Like, what are some resources you can recommend, like folks who are struggling with, say, either PTSD or agoraphobia, like anxieties or panic attacks or certain compulsions?
For the first thing is talk to somebody, anybody. Like, get out there. So many people, there's so much shame and embarrassment behind these symptoms and behaviors that people don't want to tell anybody, and they expend so much energy hiding it and managing it. It's just exhausting. So reach out, whether that's to your GP or like maybe an EFAP program from your employer if you're employed. Reach out to a counselor or psychologist. Most people don't reach out to an OT as the initial person to look for mental health treatment, but we're here too. But yeah, the key is to really, really talk to somebody, anybody, get out there. And even if you're just, most people don't know they've got that diagnosis, maybe of PTSD or a diagnosis of agoraphobia or a diagnosis of anything. They might know that they've got some anxiety. That's more commonly understood now. But, really focus on those symptoms. I encourage people to say, I'm experiencing this now, whereas I used to be like this. Like, my life is different. My life has changed. My world is smaller. I can't handle this. I don't seem to be able to manage that. Like, those symptoms and your functional change, which is what the OTs focus on, is really important. So yeah, if you don't quite get what's going on, look at your day-to-day function, what's changed, reach out to somebody, anybody, GP, counselor, psychologist, and OT. There's lots of resources online now, Anxiety BC, Here to Help BC, 811, the nurses line here in BC. So there's options. Just, taking that first step to reach out and just talk to somebody and say, hey, I don't know what's going on, but something's going on. Can somebody help me?
Yes, start somewhere.
Yeah, start somewhere.
Start somewhere. So what are some things, Natasha, that you think friends and family can do to help someone who is really struggling with some of these pieces, some of these symptoms?
Yeah, it could be really hard for friends and family, for sure. Again, like lack of understanding, lots of changes with an individual. So, that compassion, just try and be there, listen openly, without that judgment piece, have that, okay, this person's going through something, how can I help them figure it out, helping them to connect with the resources as well.
Yes.
Yeah. If they do have a diagnosis, maybe from a healthcare professional, you know what that is, educate yourself, go look up PTSD, go look up agoraphobia, get some understanding of what's going on and how to best support them with that specific diagnosis. And that could be, setting up your environment or their routines so you're not triggering the PTSD while that person might be going through the therapy, or if the person has agoraphobia and they have trouble leaving the house, well, how can you put that prolonged exposure protocol in place by just doing a just right task for that individual and not pushing them to be like, okay, well, let's go to the grocery store, let's go to the theater, if that person's just not quite ready to do that yet.
Do you work with family members as well? Not necessarily someone who's struggling, but with like other people in their life?
I do. Yeah. So a lot of the work I do definitely, I will talk to the family members, the other healthcare professionals involved. It's really an interdisciplinary team that you need to support somebody with the PTSD and agoraphobia. It affects everybody. So yeah, a lot of us OTs, we will definitely bring in the family members and speak with them, collect that collateral information. We're open to talking to the counselors, the GPs, the psychologists, whoever's involved in the individual's care. Yeah, it doesn't occur.
I love that collaborative approach, right? Like not one person can do everything on their own. So like that, let's work together on this and let's help support folks. No, it was lovely chatting with you today, Natasha. Thank you so much for sharing everything you did. And if people want to reach out, they can do so through your website. I'm gonna leave the link below, but is there anything else? Like, is there any other way to reach you, like social media?
Right now, it's just my website. Yeah,
the best way.
It's the best way. Google Business. I have a Google Business profile, but it'll just take you right to my website too. So
perfect. No, that sounds fantastic. I'm going to share the information below, and anyone who's listening and is interested in working with you, they can reach out. So thank you so much for making time and, connecting, and I'm going to stop the recording and we can continue our conversation.